today the most important constitutional issues to discuss. Some of you, I see some law students here, so you know this, but you know that when the Constitution was originally ratified, it didn't even contain a Bill of Rights. And that individual liberty, the founders thought, would be protected less by a Bill of Rights with a judiciary using the power of judicial review to intervene and protect individuals, and more by keeping the branches of the federal government, the three branches of the federal government, within their proper spheres of authority, and keeping also a proper distribution of power between the federal government and the states, that concept that we know as federalism. And so today we're going to talk about those structural issues, which have never disappeared, but have sort of reemerged in recent years on the front page of the newspapers in a way that is somewhat remarkable. Our first panel today is going to talk about the separation of powers. And the specific topic giving rise to this first panel is the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling being a federal statute that Congress periodically revisits when the debt of the United States reaches the maximum amount authorized. And as you all know, last year, as we approached the debt ceiling, there was quite a battle about whether, in fact, Congress should raise the debt ceiling to continue to authorize borrowing by the United States government, or whether it should use that occasion to try to leverage long-term financial and budgetary reforms. And so the first panel today is going to talk about that. First we'll be talking about that very topic, and then we'll be talking about some of the constitutional issues raised if that were to happen again, and the underlying question being whether or not the President of the United States has the power to do anything in the event that Congress doesn't act, because many economists say that a failure to raise the debt ceiling would have catastrophic consequences for our economy. So that's going to be our first panel. And our second panel is going to revisit a federal statute that is again back in the news, the Affordable Care Act. It's never really left the news over the last couple of years, but you probably all saw that the United States Supreme Court granted certiorari yesterday in another challenge to the Affordable Care Act, not a constitutional challenge, a question of statutory interpretation. But beneath that question of statutory interpretation are profound constitutional issues. The principal question being the extent to which the executive branch can interpret what some might charitably call an ambiguity in the statute in such a way as to further what the executive branch believes to be the statute's purposes. In any event, today we will be talking about a constitutional issue that was raised in connection with the Affordable Care Act litigation a couple of years ago, and that is the Medicaid, the Medicaid provision. The Medicaid provision sought to provide funds to the states to expand Medicaid to a greater swath of the populace that previously had been covered. But there was a condition attached to that. The condition was that if the states didn't accept these funds and expand Medicaid in the way that Congress wanted Medicaid to be expanded, the states would lose not just the funding that was offered in connection with this new program, but all of their Medicaid funding. And the Supreme Court, by a vote of 7-2, said that was unconstitutional. That was unduly coercive, and it violated federalism principles for Congress to invade the state's sphere of authority and discretion in that way. So we're going to use that ruling as the context for talking about the extent to which, if at all, the Supreme Court ought to be getting involved in regulating the relationship between Congress and the states in this way by attaching conditions to federal funds. Okay, so these are deep structural issues, but they are extremely important. And as I just mentioned, they're right at the surface of some of the most important public policy issues that we face today.
So good morning to everyone, and thanks so much to the fine folks at New Hampshire Law School for having me here today. Before you hear my distinguished co-panelists engage in what I'm sure will be a stimulating and engaging debate, you first must bear the burden of listening to the much drier and more banal talk that I have to offer. In particular, I'm going to summarize the history of the debt ceiling statute and outline its relationship to the spending, taxation, and borrowing functions of the federal government. I'm then going to explore the practical significance of the debt ceiling and highlight a few reasons why it has become the subject of some high-profile political showdowns. And I will conclude by briefly introducing you to a subject of great interest to constitutional law nerds such as myself, which is the question of whether the president has the constitutional authority to ignore the debt ceiling or breach the debt ceiling in the event that Congress fails to raise it. But before we get into the meat of my talk, let me begin with 3 preliminary observations. The first is to say that at a very broad level, the debate you'll be witnessing today concerns a central theme of constitutional law, namely the separation of powers. As many of you already know, the Constitution creates 3 branches of government and then vests in each branch a different sort of power: legislative power in Congress, executive power in the president, judicial power in the courts. Many disputes in constitutional law involve one branch's assertion that another branch is somehow encroaching on its turf. That is, the notion that one branch has violated the scheme of separated powers that the Constitution prescribes. And so the questions that we're discussing follow in that vein, implicating tensions between the legislative branch, i.e. Congress, and the executive branch, i.e. the president. The second preliminary point concerns the powers of Congress. Article 1 of the Constitution vests in Congress not a plenary legislative power, but rather a particularized set of enumerated legislative powers, actually listing one by one the various individual powers that Congress is constitutionally authorized to pursue. 3 of these enumerated powers are centrally relevant for our purposes. First, Congress has the power to tax. Second, Congress has the power to spend. And third, Congress has the power to borrow money on the credit of the United States. Congress has in turn passed a variety of laws concerning spending, taxation, and borrowing, laws that the executive branch is then obligated to carry into execution. The final point concerns the structure of the executive branch. We all know that the president sits at the top of the executive hierarchy, but you'll often hear references to other executive branch agencies and departments. In this talk, for instance, you'll hear lots of reference to the Department of the Treasury, the Secretary of the Treasury, and so forth. Now, most executive branch agencies have been created by Congress, they are funded by Congress, and they have been delegated various powers and responsibilities by Congress. These agencies, in other words, are charged with carrying out or executing a wide variety of different laws that Congress has enacted. But these agencies and their officials are also subject to significant control by the president. The president nominates individuals to head these agencies. He can, with some exceptions, unilaterally remove uncooperative agency heads from office. He can directly instruct agencies to perform or not perform various day-to-day actions. For purposes of this discussion, it may be helpful to think of the executive branch agencies and executive branch officials as a sort of informal extension of the president himself, or maybe players on a team that the president coaches. That's obviously an oversimplification, but one worth indulging, I think, as we work through some of the issues presented by the debt ceiling statute. So what is the debt ceiling? The federal government, like virtually all governments, is in the business of spending money. It pays the salaries of federal employees. It pays out benefits via entitlement programs such as Medicare and Social Security. It allocates money to agencies like the Department of Defense, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Homeland Security, and so forth. And these expenses can add up. So in the 2013 fiscal year, the federal government spent approximately $3.5 trillion in connection with these and many other programs. In general, you can think of federal spending as divided into 2 major categories: mandatory spending and discretionary spending. Mandatory spending occurs when the federal government pays out benefits or other payments pursuant to entitlement statutes, which remain in effect until repealed by Congress. Discretionary spending, by contrast, occurs in connections with appropriations bills, which tend to expire after a single fiscal year. The differences between these 2 types of spending are not especially important for our purposes. What matters most is that both mandatory spending and discretionary spending levels are ultimately established by Congress through the Article 1 lawmaking process. And they assume the form of statutory commands that the president is constitutionally obligated to carry out. So where does the federal government get all this money to spend? most familiarly, and as we all tend to remember on April 15, the government raises revenue through the imposition of taxes. Taxation levels, like spending levels, are also determined via congressionally enacted statutes, including but not limited to the lengthy and exceedingly complicated Internal Revenue Code. Again, just as the executive branch cannot willy-nilly decide to increase or decrease levels of federal spending, so too can it not willy-nilly decide to increase or decrease levels of federal taxation. Taxation levels, like spending levels, are not a matter of executive discretion, but rather the product of statutory instructions and formulae that Congress has set forth. Now, for a variety of reasons, the federal government often ends up raising less money than it spends within a given calendar year, thus resulting in a budget deficit. In 2013, for instance, the government raised only about $2.8 trillion in revenues while spending approximately $3.5 trillion, thus resulting in about a $700 billion deficit. So how did the federal government fill the $700 billion gap so as to make good on all of its spending obligations? It did so by borrowing money. Borrowing money is a time-honored American tradition. We borrowed money to finance the Revolutionary War, would later borrow money to help pay for the War of 1812, the Civil War, the construction of the Panama Canal, among other things. And remember that the Constitution itself quite explicitly gives Congress the authority to, quote, borrow money on the credit of the United States, end quote. So how did Congress carry out its money-borrowing powers during the early years of our constitutional republic? Well, up until the First World War, it generally did so on a bond-by-bond basis, enacting statutes that specifically authorized the Secretary of Treasury to borrow a specific amount of money for the purpose of paying for a specifically designated government project. But beginning in 1917, Congress took a different tack. It gave the Treasury Department a more generalized authority to borrow money on the credit of the United States, subject to a cap on the total amount of debt that the United States could incur. And thus emerged the federal debt ceiling, a law that sets a maximum on the total amount of outstanding debt that the Treasury Department is statutorily authorized to take on. The statute quite literally sets forth a dollar figure. It says, in effect, Treasury Department, you may borrow money, but only up to this limit. And if you want to borrow beyond that limit, you need to come back to us, the Congress, and ask for the additional authority to do so. So since 1917, Congress has periodically revisited the debt ceiling statute, most often amending the statute to increase the maximum amount of debt that the federal government is legally permitted to assume. Each year that the federal government runs a deficit, the amount of the national debt increases, and eventually the amount of that total national debt starts to run up against the statutory limit that Congress has set. When that occurs, the Treasury Department finds itself in a bind. It needs to issue more debt to cover the difference between its revenues and spending obligations, but it is legally prohibited from doing so by the debt ceiling statute. Thus, the Treasury Department must go to Congress and ask it to, quote, raise the debt ceiling, end quote. That is, increase the statutory maximum on the total amount of debt that we can take on. So that, in effect, is the debt ceiling. But why is it important? I think to begin the debt ceiling's importance, it's helpful to contemplate what exactly would happen if the Treasury Department suddenly found itself unable to borrow money to cover a budgetary shortfall. Remember, the debt ceiling operates independent of the spending and taxing decisions that have already been made. So the relevant scenario is one in which legally established spending levels and legally established taxation levels give rise to a budget deficit, and the debt ceiling statute precludes the Treasury Department from borrowing money to cover the deficit. What would happen under these circumstances? The short answer to this question is that no one really knows, but things would likely not be good. The most extreme and fearsome possibility is that the United States would end up defaulting on its debt. One of the various spending obligations of the federal government, after all, is the payment of interest and principal on existing IOUs. And if the debt ceiling were not raised, the government might potentially fail to meet some of these payment obligations, thus triggering the event of a default. Now, to be sure, this is not an inevitable short-term consequence of a failure to raise the debt ceiling. For a while, the Treasury Department might be able to avoid default by prioritizing payments to bondholders over various other government spending obligations. But eventually, the department might not even have enough cash on hand to cover even those payments, or it might just mess up or whatever. And then that would be bad. Many economists shudder to even contemplate the consequences of a U.S. sovereign default. The general consensus is that it would spark a serious international financial crisis that would make the last decade's financial crisis look like child's play. But even in the absence of sovereign default, other untoward consequences would likely arise from a failure to raise the debt ceiling. For one thing, such an event would likely create a great deal of chaos and confusion within the executive branch. Many of the Treasury Department's payments are made via automated systems, programmed on the assumption that the agency will always enjoy the borrowing authority it needs to cover any budgetary shortfalls. There are lots and lots of checks to be sent out each week to Social Security recipients, to government contractors, to soldiers, to bondholders, etc. And if the department no longer has the ability to make all of these payments on time, the department would have to implement some sort of prioritization scheme under which some entities get paid and others do not. Some Treasury Department officials have suggested that trying to reprogram its computers to administer such a prioritization system would be all but impossible to do. And even if administering the scheme were possible, the scheme would still give rise to significant rule of law problems, with the president in effect assuming the authority to pick and choose favorites among creditors with equally meritorious claims to on-time payment. Now finally, even if the Treasury Department managed to avoid default, and even if it managed to implement a workable prioritization scheme, many individuals and legal entities would end up receiving, at best, delayed payments of money from the U.S. government. That would be bad and unfair for those individuals, many of whom have developed reliance interests around legally promised payments from the Treasury Department. And it would also be bad for the economy writ large, which would likely not respond well to a sudden and sharp withdrawal of federal funds from the national marketplace. So why would Congress ever hesitate before honoring a request to raise the debt ceiling? Well, one reason is that some members of Congress don't like the optics of the affair. Voting to raise the debt ceiling can look like voting in support of the national debt, which generally does not play well with the voters back home. More importantly, the very dire consequences that would follow from failing to raise the debt ceiling has led some members of Congress, most recently the House Republicans in 2011 and 2013, to see the statute as a massive bargaining chip, or some would say a massive bazooka aimed right at the president's head. If there ever arose an opportunity to extract concessions from the president's party, the thinking goes, it would come along with a request from the president to raise the debt ceiling. The president needs the increase badly in order to avoid all the bad consequences of hitting the debt ceiling. And so the thinking goes, the president might be willing to give something up in exchange for the statutory enactment that he needs. In other words, if Congress conditions its approval of the debt ceiling on the enactment of a host of measures the president would otherwise veto, the president's need for a debt ceiling increase might force him to accept these measures as simply the price of an offer he can't refuse. So in 2011, the House Republicans pursued this strategy aggressively, and in the aftermath of some down-to-the-wire brinkmanship, managed to emerge from the fight with some hard-won concessions from the president and his party, most notably in the form of significant cuts to both mandatory and discretionary spending. In 2013, by contrast, the strategy largely failed. The president pledged not to negotiate over the debt ceiling increase, and at the last minute, the Republicans blinked, passing a bill that suspended the operation of the debt ceiling until February 7, 2014, without a whole lot of the way of concessions in return. And the statute has since been suspended once again, I think the suspension set to expire in March of 2015, I think. So during the debt ceiling crises of 2011 and 2013, it was by no means foreordained that Congress would manage to act before the Treasury Department's borrowing authority expired. And so the prospect of a debt ceiling breach provoked a series of debates on the question of whether the president could legally choose to disregard the debt ceiling statute instructing the Treasury Secretary to continue issuing debt in excess of the statutory limit. Those debates have become moot for the time being. The Treasury Department currently enjoys the borrowing authority it needs to make good on its payment obligations, but the questions may well resurface if and when a future Congress attempts to play chicken with the debt ceiling down the road. So let us briefly examine some of the legal theories under which the president might simply decide to ignore the debt ceiling. Imagine in particular the following scenario. It's the year 2022. The debt ceiling is now at $20 trillion, and the outstanding debt obligations stand at roughly the same amount. Congress has refused to raise the debt ceiling, notwithstanding the president's entreaties to the contrary. And the Treasury Department does not have enough cash on hand to make all of the mini payments due next Monday. You're the legal advisor to the president, who comes to you with the question of whether she can instruct the Secretary of the Treasury to borrow in excess of the borrowing limit. What do you tell the president? Well, on initial inspection, you may be inclined to tell the president that such an instruction would be flagrantly unconstitutional. Here's why. Article 2, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution provides that the president shall, quote, take care that the laws be faithfully executed, end quote. The debt ceiling is a law, the faithful execution of which requires federal debt to remain at or below $20 trillion. You might even point to Justice Robert Jackson's widely influential concurring opinion in Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer, which notes that the president's constitutional powers are at their, quote, lowest ebb when they're exercised in direct contravention of statutory commands. And that might be especially so, you would continue, when it comes to borrowing, since the Constitution quite explicitly vests in Congress, and not the president, the authority to borrow money on the credit of the United States. That, in any event, would be the prima facie case against concluding that the Constitution permits unilateral executive borrowing in excess of the debt ceiling. The president would, in effect, be rewriting the laws, a task that the Constitution reserves for Congress and Congress alone. But the situation may, in fact, be more complicated, for reasons we'll now investigate. In particular, constitutional scholars have recently outlined a few different theories under which the president might permissibly blast through the debt ceiling, ordering the Treasury Department to continue borrowing money in excess of the statutory maximum. I'm going to briefly highlight three of those theories here, identify some potential difficulties with each, and then turn the floor over to my co-panelists for a deeper exploration of these and potentially other issues. So let's call theory number one the 14th Amendment theory. The theory rests on Section 4 of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which provides that, quote, the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned, end quote. As its language makes clear, this provision grew out of concerns related to debts incurred by the federal government in connection with the Civil War. Some Republicans in Congress worried that a future Congress might attempt to repudiate the Civil War debt, or at least use the threat of repudiation as a means of extracting concessions from opposition party. But the generality of Section 4's language, which refers in the abstract to, quote, the public debt of the United States, end quote, suggests that it may apply with equal force to debts incurred today. And that in turn has led some commentators to argue that the debt ceiling statute itself violates Section 4, simply by virtue of creating doubt about the ability of the U.S. government to repay its creditors. With a debt ceiling statute on the books, no creditor of the United States can ever be fully assured that she will get her money back. The creditor must instead worry that the Secretary of the Treasury will hit the debt ceiling and thus fail to bring in enough new money to pay off existing bond obligations. And insofar as the statute thus reduces the country's credit worthiness, the argument goes, the 14th Amendment makes the statute null and void. Under the 14th Amendment theory, in other words, the president could disregard the debt ceiling on the simple theory that the statute is unconstitutional. But does Section 4 of the 14th Amendment really go so far as to invalidate the debt ceiling statute? Critics of this view suggest that Section 4 must be understood in light of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which, as we have already seen, expressly gives Congress, and not the President, the power to authorize public borrowing. Understood in that light, perhaps the better reading of Section 4 is a narrower one that does not call into question the debt ceiling statute, but rather makes clear that if the executive branch reaches the borrowing limit, it should simply do everything within its power to avoid default on the payment obligations currently outstanding. In other words, the relevant takeaway would be, on this view, that the debt ceiling is not unconstitutional, but rather that payment obligations on existing federal bond must take priority over all other spending obligations that Congress has created. Okay, so let's turn to a second theory under which you might advise the President to proceed with statutorily unauthorized borrowing. Call this the emergency powers theory. It would begin from the premise that extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures, thus suspending operation of otherwise applicable separation of powers requirements that would preclude the President from running afoul of a clear statutory command. Past presidents, most notably Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, have invoked the notion of emergency powers to justify certain extra legal measures as necessary to save the Constitution and the republic that it creates. And the argument goes the financial emergency created by a congressional refusal to raise the debt ceiling would pose a similarly existential risk. If the President does not act quickly and unilaterally, the argument goes, markets are likely to freak out. And once the genie is out of the bottle, it's very, very difficult to put it back in. So viewing the situation through the prism of emergency powers, you might advise the President that precisely because of the dire consequences that would follow from a default on U.S. debt, or even a mere failure to meet other spending obligations, the President can and should take swift and unilateral emergency action for the purpose of averting the disaster. That, in any event, might be your constitutional advice, but others have voiced skepticism of this attempt to derive a unilateral power to ignore the debt ceiling from the notion of emergency powers. First of all, most of the historical precedents on which it relies, most notably the examples of Lincoln's action during the Civil War, have primarily involved emergencies related to wars and national security, rather than markets and financial panic. In addition, most of these historical precedents have involved presidential action in the absence of congressional action, and indeed in circumstances where Congress is simply incapable of acting fast enough to meet the crisis. Here, by contrast, Congress has already spoken. It has said quite plainly, no more debt in excess of this amount, come hell or high water. By breaching the debt ceiling, critics say the President is not so much acting swiftly to confront an emergency that Congress is unable to deal with. Rather, she is acting in direct defiance of instructions on a point that Congress has already decided to deal with. Congress's choice may be a stupid one, to be sure, but once that choice has been made, the argument goes, it is not a choice that the President may permissibly override. Okay, so the final theory I'll highlight today focuses not on the 14th Amendment or the existence or non-existence of emergencies, but rather on the inevitability of unconstitutional action by the President. Professors Michael Dorf and Neil Buchanan have called this the, quote, trilemma theory. When the Treasury hits the debt limit and Congress refuses to raise it, the President has, in essence, three options at her disposal. First, the President can decline to spend money, thus violating the various appropriations and entitlement statutes that specifically instruct her to spend that money. Second, the President could unilaterally raise taxes, thus violating the various tax-related statutes that specifically prohibit taxation in excess of what they prescribe. Or finally, the President can borrow more money, thus running afoul of the debt ceiling. What's important to see here is that all three choices involve the violation of some law that Congress has enacted. And so, proponents of the trilemma theory point out, the President is destined to encroach on congressional authority in one way or the other. There simply is no way out. And with the trilemma present, the argument continues, the relevant inquiry becomes identifying which of these unconstitutional options is least bad from a constitutional perspective. And without getting into too much detail here, let me just say that some constitutional scholars have argued that breaching the debt ceiling statute really is the least unconstitutional of these three options. That might be so for one of several reasons. Perhaps, for instance, breaching the debt ceiling does less to disturb important and elaborate interbranch compromises than would breaching the hodgepodge violation of a random appropriation statute or taxation statute. Perhaps breaching the debt ceiling minimizes discretion and lawlessness within the executive branch, obviating the unwelcome specter of allowing the president to pick and choose among favored and disfavored claimants of federal money, subjects of federal taxation. Or perhaps breaching the debt ceiling helps to honor the spirit, if not the letter, of the 14th Amendment's command that the validity of the public debt shall not be questioned. These are just a few ideas, but hopefully you get the notion. So what of the trilemma argument? Well, it's also subject to criticism on at least two separate grounds. First, a critic might reject the premise that debt ceiling brinkmanship really does create a trilemma of the sort that Professors Dorff and Buchanan have imagined. Rather, the critic would say the president can and should escape the horns of the trilemma by simply acceding to whatever conditions Congress has demanded in exchange for a debt ceiling increase. That may well be unpalatable from a political or policy-based perspective, but it would be a fully constitutional decision for the president to make. Thus, the argument goes, a not unconstitutional option is available to the president from the start. No trilemma thus exists, and so no inquiry into least unconstitutional options is necessary. Even assuming the existence of a trilemma, moreover, a critic might maintain that breaching the debt ceiling is not, in fact, the least bad of the three unconstitutional options. Perhaps, for instance, we could argue that Congress's refusal to raise the debt ceiling counts as the most recent expression of congressional intent, thus rendering a president's decision to ignore the debt ceiling most problematic from a separation of powers perspective. Or perhaps one could argue that the state of the law surrounding the president's so-called impoundment power, that is the power simply not to spend appropriated funds, is sufficiently uncertain as to render unilateral non-spending decisions by the president less constitutionally problematic than a unilateral breach of the debt ceiling. These are just a few hypotheses, but the important point is that even with a trilemma acknowledged, the question of how to resolve it is a matter of some debate. So that, in brief, is your whirlwind tour of all the vexing mysteries and complexities raised by the debt ceiling statute. And with the tour thus complete, let me now turn the floor over to my co-panelists for a more thorough vetting of these very interesting constitutional issues. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. This is my first time at a public speaking event in New Hampshire, which is the 45th state that I'm doing something like that, because counting states that you visited is for amateurs. So that's why I jumped at the opportunity when John invited me to come here, and I have to commend John for putting together an all-Princeton panel. You really know that you're getting the hard-hitting analysis when you do that. And it's funny, something else that John said during his introduction was that this isn't kind of the typical constitutional clash of sexy issues that this, debt ceiling, technicalities of Obamacare and Medicaid might, put you to sleep, especially on a Saturday morning. Well, no joke. Last night when I checked into the hotel, the clerk asked, "Oh, so what are you here for? Is it your first time to New Hampshire?" Kind of small talk, whatnot. And I told him I was here to talk about constitutional issues regarding the debt ceiling. He said, "Really? And you're not going to put people to sleep with that?" That's what he said. So I told him, well, I have some jokes prepared, and although I am a little worried that this was described as a TED Talk, because I've seen a couple of these TED Talks, and they normally involve walking around the stage and some sophisticated PowerPoint presentation, some earnest personal anecdote. Well, look, they won't allow us to walk around because the microphones are tied, and I think PowerPoint is unconstitutional, and I really have no personal anecdote relating to the debt ceiling. So I don't know if this would qualify really as that sort of thing. And moreover, This is a really odd constitutional debate. I mean, I love my job. I get to, over the years that I've been at Cato, I've had to bone up and engage in public affairs debates on everything from guns to healthcare to immigration to voting rights to campaign finance and everything in between. Most of those, all of those areas have a lot of academic writing, court precedent, a whole host of authority that you can look at and learn from and rely on and cite. This debate, there is one law review article by Professors Buchanan and Dorff, as well as 2 online supplements to that article. And after that, we're talking blog posts, some op-eds, and some quotes in New York Times articles. I mean, that's it. I myself have not actually published on this issue, and as far as I can tell, I'm here because I appeared on a panel at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia about a year ago on this subject, and I appeared there because Jeff Rosen, the president of the National Constitution Center, knows that I'm happy to travel anywhere and speak my views on constitutional issues on anything, and that's about it. So I apologize that you're getting this so-called expert who doesn't really know that much about the subject, because there's not that much to know. It's all kind of new and weird, frankly. And even further, the topic of this series is constitutionally speaking, and this isn't so much. This topic isn't exactly. I mean, yeah, we talk about the Constitution. I'll go into certain provisions and so forth, but really, this is extra constitutionally speaking, because whatever the president does in this scenario, short of acceding to congressional demands and signing the, repeal of Obamacare in exchange for heightening the raising the debt ceiling or what have you, is extra constitutional. And so there might be some validity or strong arguments for each aspect of the trilemma resolution, whether that be unilaterally blowing through the debt ceiling, whether it be unilaterally raising taxes, unilaterally cutting spending, each of which the president cannot do under our separation of powers scheme. As a matter of policy, as a matter of prudence, there might be arguments for each of them, but make no mistake that they are not constitutional. And even Dorff and Buchanan are arguing from this sort of, we have to decide, the president has to decide what's the least unconstitutional thing. Well, there's no such thing. We don't have a weight or a measure, a scale to figure out comparative constitutionality of different types of actions. And moreover, the courts can't decide any of this, because nobody has standing. Possibly Congress would, but if Congress could agree on what kind of resolution to pass, then we wouldn't be in the dilemma or trilemma or multilemma regardless. And even if someone had standing, courts would clearly say this is a political question with no real justiciable legal principles to enforce. So again, this is a really bizarre constitutional debate we're having. And like with most things, bizarre or not bizarre, we have to start with the text of the Constitution to start analyzing it. So, everyone get out your pocket constitutions. This is the Cato Pocket Constitution. It's a twofer. You buy the Constitution, you get a Declaration of Independence for free. Although this is my limited edition Shapiro wedding Constitution. You can't access this one. My wife and I, here's our name, the date. My wife's a very tolerant woman. So anyway, 14th Amendment, Section 4. The validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, ... some language regarding the Civil War, not really relevant here, shall not be questioned. Okay? There are 3 questions, just in what I read, about definitional issues that might affect this discussion. First of all, the validity of the public debt. What is public debt? Does it mean issuance of, debt to pay for the Civil War, as the explicit language is there? Well, no, because it says including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for suppressing insurrection and so forth. So that's just an example. So it's broader than just Civil War stuff. Okay. Well, is it just bonds and other type of debt security financial instruments that literally make us go into debt, or is it also various other kinds of obligations, like the promise to pay Social Security, the salaries of federal workers, the appropriated monies to spend on this, that, or the other federal program, which we haven't gone into debt for, but Congress has specified that we shall make these sorts of payments. There's scholars arguing on both sides of that question. Authorized by law, the validity of public debt authorized by law. What does that mean? Does that mean the debt ceiling itself Congress has to authorize? Or does it mean these spending bills, these appropriation bills? Shall not be questioned. Well, what does it mean to question the validity of debt? Some scholars argue that any action by government that heightens the chance of default is questioning the validity of the debt. So perhaps authorizing more spending makes it more likely that the government will default in the future. Or cutting taxes, because that means less revenues in the moment. Maybe on a dynamic model you increase taxes. Don't want to get into that economic debate here. Maybe raising taxes, because that depending on, again, which economic model you're using. Maybe the president engaging in risky behavior himself, personally or politically, makes it more likely that the government will default, that rating agencies will lower, all these different things. So that's not clear. So even that very small textual piece that I just read doesn't really, opens up even more weirdness to this debate, as it were. The only Supreme Court opinion, the only real judicial analysis of that section is a 1935 case called Perry versus United States, involving a challenge to certain bond obligations that were to be paid, and the interest was to be paid in gold and things like this. And the court held, an opinion by, Justice Hughes, said, "We regard Section 4 as a confirmatory of a fundamental principle, which applies as well to the government bonds in question and to others duly authorized by the Congress as to those issues before the amendment was adopted. Nor can we perceive any reason for not considering the expression, the validity of the public debt, as embracing whatever concerns the integrity of the public obligations." So again, what's a public obligation? Is it literally the taking out of debt, or some operation on the bond market by the Fed? Or is it Congress saying, yes, we will pay our veterans, yes, we will pay Medicaid, yes, we will pay food stamps, whatever the case may be. Moreover, if indeed the validity of the public debt isn't to be questioned, well, what about debt that's issued by the president in blowing through the debt ceiling, because that's the least unconstitutional option? Wouldn't that presidential debt be less valid and more subject to default, and therefore be unconstitutional ab initio from the very beginning of the idea? There's just, we're really in a brave new world here. And so my position ultimately, normally I'm pretty opinionated and outspoken about lots of different things, but I don't really have, sorry to disappoint John, a firm red meat view on this. My position isn't simply that the president cannot step into the breach and do anything. His hands are tied. He's paralyzed. I suppose that's my position of what the Constitution allows him to do. But Section 4 of the 14th Amendment applies both to the president and Congress, and Congress is just as much in breach of its obligations as the president is in, perhaps violating his duty to take care that the laws are enforced. And so indeed, maybe it's a joint obligation on both of them, and they're both failing. Well, what does that tell us? It tells us that this really is a constitutional crisis of sorts. The solution does not come from the four corners of the Constitution, and we can't sort of elegantly elide the dilemma, trilemma, whatever, away by saying what's less unconstitutional, or what would create less damage in the policy world, or something like that. What would be less likely to blow up the republic, say, because this Constitution's not a suicide pact. That doesn't constitutionalize whatever course of action you think must be taken. Instead, with less than full satisfaction, would urge that the president in that circumstance would have to do what he or she thinks is the best course for the nation, and let the nation judge him eventually and announce that, the only constitutional option available to me is indeed to accede to this congressional blackmail, and I'm not going to do that, or I am going to do that, but let the voters judge again. And like Lincoln, say that I am doing this. I know it violates the Constitution, but I am left no option by the recalcitrant Congress, and therefore, again, I would leave it to the discretion of the president in deciding which unconstitutional option isn't the most or the least unconstitutional, but which one is best from a prudential perspective, and let him or her make that case to the public. And if the public doesn't like it, they can impeach him. If the public likes it, they can vote out Congress for being recalcitrant. And if the public is hopelessly split, well, I guess the markets will be the judge, and eventually either the economic or the political scenario will break the gridlock. Thank you.
Okay, well, I do have a PowerPoint, just like someone from the Cato Institute, to use the Constitution to nullify things they don't like.
Oh, yeah. Let me do that.
So, all right, thanks very much to John Gravy and to Constitutionally Speaking and to the Warren Rudman Center for holding this event and for having me. I'm very excited to talk about this issue. I have a political science background rather than a legal training, which maybe makes me come at the issue a little bit differently. And I'm now sort of a policy wonk with a legal bent at the Brookings Institution. So I want to start with the policy point, which is, if you take one thing away from my talk today, I would prefer it be that the debt ceiling is a bad idea as a matter of policy. We'd be better off to get rid of it. I don't think it's unconstitutional, as some professors have argued, but that doesn't mean that it is wise or desirable or at all helpful in trying to push us toward responsible budgeting. Like Warren Rudman, who I greatly admired, being a fiscal conservative is at the center of my political identity. But in my judgment, opposing increases in the debt ceiling is just about the worst way for fiscal conservatives to serve their cause. It distracts attention away from the real action in the budgeting process and decisions about taxation. And realistically, because nobody wants to have catastrophic default, Congress must succeed in the end and raise the debt ceiling. Its leverage is an illusion, largely. So as a result, I call it, the debt ceiling is like a roach motel for fiscal conservatives. They can go in to make some fiery speeches, but they won't come out, at least until they have agreed to move on to other issues. So I think hopefully the current sitting Congress has started to figure this out. Soon-to-be Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said since the election last Tuesday, he said all the right things about wanting to avoid debt ceiling brinksmanship. Hopefully the debt ceiling will be made irrelevant through normal politics, or better yet, removed altogether, and the whole discussion you're hearing today will become moot. However, what if Congress does not raise the debt ceiling? What if we are really hard up against it? So we want to think through the constitutional implications of the counterfactual in which Congress really digs in. As I see it, the resulting confrontation can result in a boom or a hiccup. And I want to explain to you how I think the president can best try to steer things toward a hiccup, perhaps ultimately by disregarding the debt ceiling statute. So, as I see it, before considering that eventuality, I want to first counsel avoidance. So, quite apart from saying that we should do away with the debt ceiling as a matter of policy, we should also want our public officials to steer away from apocalyptic version of debt ceiling crises. That is good constitutional practice. That is a fulfillment of constitutional duties. You could root it in the 14th Amendment's Section 4 regarding the public debt. You could root it in the various policymakers' oaths that they take as they become legislators or the president. They swear an oath or affirm that they will support the Constitution. And in my opinion, that doesn't mean just following the right law professor's interpretation of what the Constitution means. It means taking practical steps to protect the country's integrity, and that very much includes its financial integrity, which I think is every bit as instrumental to the country's survival as any military emergency. So if your version of fidelity to the Constitution brings some sort of crisis and permanent damage to the nation, perhaps fidelity is no great virtue. So my first prescription is practice crisis avoidance as long as possible. And so that means the Treasury Department should be exercising all of its various extraordinary measures that allow it to legally delay the day of reckoning. As Professor Koenen told you, we have a March deadline when the debt ceiling will come back into effect, but the Treasury Department will be able to take steps that will probably give us some headroom to maneuver all the way into late summer, early fall of 2015. And they should absolutely use these, what are basically accounting tricks. I think it's also important that they have some extra extraordinary measures up their sleeves so that they might buy us a little more time than they publicly announce to resolve a crisis at the last minute. And when it comes to these tricks, the duller the better. The idea is to buy time and manage to muddle along without getting anyone too hot and bothered. So that leads me to my second prescription, which is we should avoid any eye-catching solutions that purport to circumvent the debt ceiling purely legally. So many of you may have heard about the platinum coin option, by which the United States Treasury could use its seigniorage privileges to essentially increase its balances and get out of the problem by issuing $1 trillion platinum coin, which some people think is against the spirit of the law, but technically within the letter of the law. To me, this is a terrible idea. It's totally self-defeating. It's basically trying to say, oh yes, we're a respectable nation and nobody needs to worry about us paying our debts in valuable currency. And to show you that we mean it, we're going to act like a banana republic and do strange and bizarre things with our currency. So to me, those kinds of ideas are very much self-defeating. So we then come to the crux of the matter, as you've already heard about, the trilemma. You have appropriations laws that are legal obligations. So you could fail to honor some of those either in spending or in debt service. You could figure out some way to raise revenues without authorization, basically impose some kind of unlawful tax, or you could violate the debt ceiling statute. So again, the president has a constitutional obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, but here some law has to get broken. One of these three. So what should the president do when the output of our constitutional system fails to make any sense? Not every instance in which that question comes up rises to the level of a crisis. Some may just produce puzzles for constitutional law professors to have fun with. They may not really pose a grave threat to the nation. But when the situation does rise to the level of a constitutional crisis, as a debt ceiling showdown certainly could, I think there are worse things that you can do than to think about what our most distinguished crisis leader would do. So Abraham Lincoln, I will go with that route that Professor Koenen outlined. So Lincoln's basic insight upon being inaugurated in 1861 and seeing the country in acute danger of dissolution was that his deepest constitutional obligation was to the survival of the Union. He sought to ensure that the damage done by the seceding states would not be a mortal blow to the constitutional order. So with that in mind, he took quite a number of steps that were constitutionally dubious on their face. I don't actually believe that he ever came out and said that he was violating the Constitution. But he certainly did some things that were hard to square with the Constitution, most notoriously suspending habeas corpus, such that he could arrest people he thought were working against the Union's interests. And he said to his critics of that action, who thought that he was violating the Constitution, "Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, and the government itself to go to pieces, lest that one be violated?" So he's prioritizing the big picture of constitutional health over the particulars. Now, taken to its logical extreme, that principle could clearly be very dangerous. But taken responsibly, I think it can be very useful guidance for thinking about what to do in a debt ceiling crisis. I think number two, raising taxes without any legal authorization is pretty clearly out. In the American context, taxation without representation is just about the definition of tyranny. And I just don't see how that could go anywhere. It also wouldn't make much sense to escape the trilemma through suspending legally obligated debt payments. That brings on the Armageddon we are trying to avoid by directly calling into question the reliability of the United States debt and very possibly destabilizing the world financial system, which is built upon the foundation of that reliability. So to my mind, the practical choices are between failing to honor obligating spending commitments or ignoring the debt ceiling. Okay, so first, why do I think we would want not to simply cut spending? So first, it feels more like a default. It's not, I don't think, the same as missing debt payments. I think investors would be able to tell the difference between missing appropriated payments and missing debt payments. But it basically provides evidence that the U.S. won't honor some commitment that has come due in a timely manner. So that represents a commitment not being honored, not because of specific political decisions made by the Congress, but because of general political dysfunction. And I think it would therefore be a blow to the financial reputation of the United States. So second, as Professor Cronin talked about, there are some logistical problems. It sounds easy to make our debt payments while withholding our appropriated spending or some portion of that spending, but it turns out that Treasury's computer systems are not really designed to do anything like that. It might work out, but there's a risk that it will cause a big mess. So third, I think it's important to understand that this is just as illegal as either of the other options. The president is legally obligated to spend what Congress has appropriated. That's made very clear by the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, which came out of budget fights between President Nixon and Congress. Nixon claimed the power to be able to not spend all money appropriated. Congress very clearly repudiated that position, I believe, over his veto. So fourth, if we imagine that the president should cut as much spending as necessary so that he's only spending as much revenue as comes in through taxation, that essentially asks him to act in an arbitrary manner and choose without any guidance from the Congress about which payments ought to be prioritized. And I do believe that's totally antithetical to the constitutional design and, again, risks presidential tyranny. Finally, perhaps most practically, cutting spending creates immediate losers, people who were counting on payments, who had planned around them, and who are going to be harmed in the moment by missing payments. So ignoring the ceiling, on the other hand, has a number of benefits. So first of all, the way you ignore the ceiling is simply to go about business as usual. You go to the bond markets, you say, don't worry about that debt ceiling thing, we're just issuing some more debt. And the buyers are not coerced into this transaction. It's totally their decision whether to buy that debt or not. It's totally consensual, nobody gets hurt. Second, the feeling of business as usual is exactly what I'd say you want to promote. You want to give the sense that this is not going to become a crisis of a debilitating sort. We're just going to get through this. And so the president can play it off as if this is just a slightly aggravated version of what always happens with these debt ceiling negotiations. Invite a resolution in which the whole thing is treated as a hiccup rather than a full-blown constitutional crisis for the history books. Basically, trying to make it seem like this is just a glitch, a malfunction, a temporary snag. So I think you want to give the impression that the United States always pays its debts on time. So as those of you who watch the HBO show Game of Thrones will have learned from the Lannisters, that is a reputation you really want to have. Somebody who always pays their debts. You want to have that reputation even if it isn't 100% true. Having it will make you a more powerful institution, cause people to treat you differently. So as it happens, it's not entirely true with the United States. In 1979, after some debt ceiling standoff dragged on, and then the Treasury was authorized to issue new debt, but there was a foul-up with the word processing systems in the Treasury's back office after the debt ceiling fight, and they missed payments on the debt for 3 weeks. Now, eventually, those were made up with interest. It was a delay, not a permanent repudiation of any debt, certainly. But it could technically have been considered a default. And it led to a small but lasting spike in the interest rates the Treasury needed to pay to entice investors. However, it did not lead to a constitutional crisis. It's little remembered by now. And so the goal with a future debt ceiling standoff, in my opinion, would be to make the whole situation seem like a regrettable temporary snafu, a malfunction not of the Treasury's back office, but a malfunction of interbranch relations, rather than a permanent warping of the constitutional separation of powers. So my third prescription is, rather than maximizing the drama of the crisis, as I think making selective spending cuts could do, the president should try to sell the idea that there isn't a crisis at all and see if that can turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy. By going to the debt markets, he would create a moment of truth for Congress. However they want to characterize it, would they like to send investors a signal that they should understand that the United States is always good for its debts, or won't they? So Congress has to choose. Will it be maximally confrontational and declare that any debt issued over the ceiling is illegal and will not be honored? Or will it instead choose to smooth things over and accede to the idea that the debt isn't illegal, it's just not yet legal, soon to be legal, legally challenged? So in my opinion, Congress would have a very strong incentive to act to resolve the uncertainty very quickly. And the president, by framing things in this way, could offer them that way out. Even at just a temporary suspension of the debt ceiling for a few weeks or a month or something to allow negotiations to go on. Congress will feel tremendous pressure to play along. Now, the wisdom of this advice depends a lot on concrete specifics of the situation. It depends on the numbers in Congress. So if the debt ceiling standoff has been encouraged most by a small slice of the majority party, then the Speaker will have plenty of maneuvering room to pivot to the not a crisis framing when the chips are down. On the other hand, if the Speaker himself and a majority of the majority party are dead set against any kind of accommodation, then I do think that the strategy I've outlined could seriously backfire. Thankfully, I think that the world we live in right now is more like this one. I think the Speaker would be grateful for a chance to back away from a historic constitutional crisis rather than embracing it. So just a quick recap. My three prescriptions are all about making sure that a debt ceiling crisis doesn't become too interesting for constitutional scholars of the future. Keep it boring. First, by avoiding a moment of reckoning as long as possible in the first place. Second, by avoiding some over-clever and dramatic way of trying to circumvent the debt ceiling. And third, if it comes to that, by ignoring the debt ceiling in such a way that it leaves the door open to a quick and unmemorable resolution. In case anyone's interested, I'll just leave up some sites to some articles that I've written about the policy reasons for against the debt ceiling, and thank you so much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, everybody. Philip, I can tell you're a new parent. It sounds like the prescription is to be like Not too much drama in front of the kids, right? You know, bottle calm. It's not on. You got it now.
Maybe
Green light
tap
just went on. How's that? There we go. Okay. All right. Good. Good. Excellent. Well, I wanted to offer no obligation, but you know, maybe we could take 10 minutes or so to, and I wanted to ask if the panelists had any comments or questions for one another, and then we can turn and involve everybody. So, would any of the three of you like to make a point or ask a question?
Sure. Well, not that slide, but the previous one with the different options, the no drama, avoid, and whatnot. The accounting and extraordinary measures to postpone the day of reckoning do things like selling public lands and revaluing bond coupons and I don't know, the Fed printing more currency. Are those temporary postponements, or are those kind of additions onto the trilemma that there's actually 6 different things that the president could do?
Well, the ones that we use now generally tend to be things like, instead of funding the government's pension funds, we temporarily stop funding them and we'll backfill them once the ceiling has been raised. So again, they tend to be sort of boring accounting maneuvers. I don't think the Federal Reserve printing more money really helps things at all, because it doesn't affect the Treasury's balances. I think there might be some maneuvering along the platinum coin lines that could be taken, but again, I think it's important not to do anything too flashy and not to do anything that seems to be sort of a clever dissolution of the problem. I think the problem is a real one, and you can put it off through certain kinds of accounting trickery, but you can't ultimately just dissolve the whole problem.
I will say so I have personally always really kind of secretly hoped that the platinum coin option would be exercised, primarily because, as I understand it, the option actually requires at some point you have to mint the coin and then walk it over or transport it to the Treasury Department or the Federal Reserve.
It makes a good movie.
And I mean, if someone were to pickpocket, that would be the all-time most successful pickpocketing
Best paper
attempt.
movie ever, yeah.
Absolutely, and as Philip pointed out, it does provide a very cool opportunity for putting a unique public
Yeah.
figure's head on that coin, too.
Right. There was a lot of fun had with that. Some people thought, put President Reagan on it, then they'll have to accept it.
So one question that I have for y'all, and I mean, I think this is one of the things that makes this kind of a confusing and weird issue to talk about, is, so there's the one question of sort of what the president should do, but there's also the question of, well, what do you think the president will do? And to me, it's actually, in this circumstance, it's a little bit hard to disaggregate the two issues for reasons that Ilya said. That is, the president is, in a way, simply exercising his best judgment as to, well, how do I deal with this crisis that I've been presented with? So I guess the question I pose to you is, to both of you all who know more about this than I do, but what do you think is the most likely scenario, just descriptively, as to what the president would do in the event that we hit the debt ceiling and there's no more time for extraordinary measures?
Well, first I want to say how unlikely I really do think that is, because I think there's not really a divergence of interests here between Congress and the president. In the end, they both have really, really strong incentives to not be jointly the set of policymakers that led us into this crisis. So I think there's always a chance to pass, a 5-day suspension of the increase. And we actually saw in 1995 and 1996, when the debt ceiling was part of the budget fights between the Gingrich-led Congress and President Clinton, there were some very short-term debt ceiling increases. So I think there is a really strong push to keep it away, and as long as the leadership isn't sort of dead set on a crisis, they would do so. Having said that, to try to be actually responsive to your question, I hope that what I've outlined here has the virtue of being sort of practically attractive, because I do see it as the most likely reason we would end up in this strange situation where we really have come up against the ceiling is that some misunderstanding has happened, and so we could play it off and work from there, move forward. Again, if you imagine a set of circumstances in which a majority of the Congress really says under no circumstances we will raise the debt ceiling, that puts us in a very different world.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think that short of the platinum coin and other gimmickry, there are a lot of kind of extraordinary measures. I liked how you put that, including selling the gold in Fort Knox, or selling public lands. Kind of what I put in my question to Philip. Selling the Treasury's mortgage-backed securities, revaluing different types of instruments. At the end of the day, I suppose the president would have to. I mean, it depends who's the president and what the politics at the given time are. But if the president did decide to unilaterally issue new debt, simultaneously blame Congress and put even more pressure to break the gridlock that way, that would have to be kind of super coupon bonds of some sort, because the markets would not think that that was as valid as, or the risk of default was the same low level as in the normal course of debt. But it really, it's even if you're talking specifically about, what would this president with this Congress do, it's still so much of an abstraction, because it really turns on the crisis of the moment and kind of the emotions and the animal spirits of the given time.
If I can just ask one question, we're focused on what everybody regards as a true emergency when we focus specifically on the debt ceiling and the potential of extreme economic dislocation and distress. If we frame the issue a little bit more generally, however, we could frame it in terms that would apply in other contexts. We have a dysfunctional Congress that is not responsive to what many people would describe as a perceived emergency, a perceived crisis. Is there danger in recognizing, as both of you have to at least a certain extent, that the executive branch, that the president has the prerogative to define a crisis, to label congressional inaction as dysfunctional, and to take unilateral action? And just to pull one modern example, the immigration crisis, the widely held notion among many that we have to do something about immigration, but the politics of the day are making that difficult. As you suggest that the president would have to do something, does it worry you about the precedent it would set if we take the scenario, describe it a little bit more generally, and then perhaps open things up to an empowered executive who would be able to take this sort of action in other contexts? And I'll throw that out to any of you who'd like to reply to that.
I think this is different than the immigration scenario or any other. I mean, it's different to say that, well, this area of public policy really isn't working, and Congress and the president can't agree on how to reform it, and therefore the president does something on his own. That's very different from the debt ceiling, where we reach a debt ceiling, and so anything the president does is against the law and violates separation of powers. In immigration, we have a really, really bad system. I'm an immigrant myself. I just became a citizen in June. Like most immigrants, I do a job native-born Americans won't, defending the Constitution. But that doesn't mean the president gets extra powers when Congress won't act. I mean, the reason why we're discussing this in terms of a constitutional crisis or something is because literally anything the country defaults. Well, I suppose the only constitution the country doesn't default if our broken immigration or even healthcare system isn't working, at least not in any foreseeable future.
That's true, but you can never underestimate the power of lawyers and politicians to characterize in a way that it would convince.
No, but you can imagine like the next Republican president, wants to completely repeal or completely transform the healthcare system and say, well, nothing is getting through Congress. The Democrats are filibustering in the Senate, therefore I have to act now unilaterally. Will not be enforcing any of Obamacare, something like that. Whether it's about a precedent or I just see these problems as really different in kind.
I agree with everything Illy just said, but I would say yes, it would be a disturbing precedent. There's a whole lot of reasons we would want to avoid coming to this juncture, because it sort of opens, as you say, it opens the door to certain kinds of possibilities outside, away from our normal constitutional operation, which we think usually serves us well. So I think Congress has every reason to try to make sure that the laws it passes don't collectively create impossible situations, and that's a duty that they should take very seriously.
I mean, I'll just note, just as I think I agree with my co-panelists, by the way. I think it's a distinctive situation, but one of the interesting problems that's created by gridlock in Congress is that, so in one sense you say, okay, well, the more dysfunctional Congress is, the less actually ever gets done. Another concern, though, is the more dysfunctional Congress is, the more unable it is to respond to whatever public sentiment is and whatever the public wants to get done. You create this sort of hydraulic pressure that, in effect, increases the president's power. At least from a political perspective, it gives the president more of an opportunity to assert and grab the opportunity to exercise unilateral action. And from a separation of powers perspective, that's troubling. And it's not to say that the president's doing that is justifiable, but if Congress is unable to act in sufficient ways, it does, I think, increase the risk of that happening.
Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, two thoughts. First of all, obviously if the president does something unconstitutional, the logical series of events is for Congress to impeach the president for having done such a thing. Oddly enough, it appears there's actually no recourse if Congress does something unconstitutional, which it appears they might have done already by creating the trilemma in the first place. They've approved expenditures that are not covered by taxes and are not covered by the debt ceiling, and therefore have essentially violated their own oath. But I don't think you can impeach Congress en masse, although we might like to.
Well, the president's complicit in that, right? He signed those bills, unless you're talking about some veto override, in which case I suppose it's only Congress. But
well, he wouldn't have signed the debt limit bill because that's history. And he wouldn't have signed like the authorization for Medicare or Social Security because those are history. So there are pieces of this that the current president could not be held.
Well, a president signed it.
A president
Neither
did.
would all the members of Congress have been a part of passing those.
Yeah. So you get the other thought that came to my mind is the president could establish up front what the battle plan is. So, for example, he could take Philip's suggestion, say, this is what we'll do if we can't get to the end game. Everybody knows what the game is going to look like, so don't be surprised if we get there. And that would even reduce further that tension potentially.
So I would really advise against that if I were advising the Treasury Department or the President. I think the whole appeal to having these extraordinary measures is that you keep them in your back pocket so that they can be pulled out at the last minute. Otherwise, they become just incorporated into the process. Everyone knows we have the extraordinary measures now, so they no longer buy us any real room. We just delay the date of the crisis, but it comes sure enough. So part of what my counsel is to make sure that there are some tricks up the sleeve that can be used to buy even extra time beyond what's already expected. On your first question, I'd like to address, I think there's sort of I mean, there's an obvious answer, which is we have elections. And I think, you know, especially folks who think about things in the law school constitutional law version, we always want to think about sort of a clean remedy being offered by courts, or perhaps impeachment is sort of a parallel system to the courts. But the Constitution often doesn't create such clean remedies. It creates a political system that has the resources to cleanse itself of problems through politics and through the clash of the different branches. And so, by all means, I would think, you know, this wouldn't necessarily come with good timing, or it might, but biannual elections and having those, that's the strongest guarantee of our constitutional integrity, at least if we have an engaged citizenry who holds them accountable on these kinds of issues.
Yeah, Congress doesn't act. That is, it doesn't enforce, it doesn't execute. It passes laws. And you can challenge those laws in court. If a particular member of Congress has done something egregious, you know, there are remedies for that. But Congress as a whole, there's good reason it can't be impeached. Impeachment is the removal of an officer for failing his or her duty in some way. And Congress is not an officer. It's a body. And so, indeed, the remedy there is the electoral process.
Sir?
Thank you. One thing that has not been addressed is the wasteful spending that government is, you know, doing now, which is probably the biggest driver of the debt crisis. There are entire departments that are in violation of federal constitution and state constitutions. And I would name one in particular, the Department of Education. Billions upon billions of dollars with, and then you add in the retirements, and it just keeps escalating and escalating out of control. And they have no constitutional authority. The Department of Energy is a good picture in contrast to what has taken place during the past decade in this country. Entirely separate of the Department of Energy, which has more or less suppressed our energy independence efforts for decades. The private sector is now producing products, energy products for the country and the world if the government would allow them to market them overseas. We are now the #1 producer in the world of energy products. And I would urge anybody that wants to see some facts to read Mr. Tillerson's State of Energy message, which was, I believe, just within the past couple of months. We have an abundance of energy, not due to the Department of Energy, though. And the corruption that took place within the Department of Energy, handing out hundreds of billions of dollars to favorite companies that were politically connected and then went under, has put a burden on the taxpayer. We are in dangerous banana republic territory, and we should be looking at where the money is being spent.
And connecting that to the debt ceiling, is it your view that we're in dangerous enough territory that, you know, yes, this is heavy medicine, but we're facing a real serious illness. Is that the question you'd like to ask?
Corruption is feeding an unnecessary debt.
So first of all, you had an order of magnitude problem there. I'd say that the waste that you could plausibly assign to the Department of Energy would not be hundreds of billions of dollars. I think it's more like hundreds of millions of dollars, which is a pretty important difference. I'd say, you know, your question really gets to the heart of sort of how we think about constitutional law and politics, constitutional politics. I mean, your way of looking at it is just one way, and obviously the outputs of the political process suggest that our Congress and the people who have elected them don't agree with you. For decades and decades, we've been building the Department of Education. People do think that that fits within constitutional norms. That's been the output of our political process. If you want to reverse that because you think it's the wrong way for the Constitution to be instantiated, you have to win the politics. There's no remedy by which it can just be sort of reversed. And so I think the debt ceiling, I think it sort of fits into that. People would like it to somehow be this thing that allows their vision of politics to automatically get implemented, but it's not a very effective tool at all to that end, and it really short circuits the constitutional politics that ought to characterize our decision-making processes.
It's rather obvious to me that federal involvement in education is unconstitutional, and indeed that's why perhaps I was deficient in making my whole presentation based on this second-order world. The first-order response, I suppose, that I should have started with is that we would avoid this entire debate if the federal government were limited to its constitutionally authorized powers. We would be nowhere near what the debt ceiling is now, and et cetera, et cetera. But that's obviously kind of a non-starter if I were to begin that, and we would be talking about something completely different.
Hi, I'm Shep Melnick from Boston College. I was very convinced by Phil's presentation, and I want to ask this question. If President Obama had seen that presentation and also been convinced, what should he do? And it strikes me that on the one hand, it would be smart to give a speech basically saying, I'm going to treat this like a hiccup, a preemptive strike. But on the other hand—
At what point in the process do you mean?
right now, before the new Congress takes control. But what you said a few minutes ago is we shouldn't show our hand and show all the gimmicks. So is there any way to have a preemptive strike, which would mean that the Republicans wouldn't have any incentive to engage in this brinkmanship without undercutting your strategy by showing what you could do?
Well, I think it should just be understood as it would be a fairly confrontational thing for him to do. And I just have this sense, I'm sort of pro-muddling through as part of my view of politics, such that if we can avoid ending up in crisis land, we should do so, not sort of invite the confrontation. So, we've had the debt ceiling, as Michael explained in his talk at the beginning, since the First World War, and it came into its current form in the 1930s. And there's been all sorts of politicking around it ever since then. During the Eisenhower administration, there were some tense moments around the debt ceiling and some confrontation. But really, the crisis in 2011, and to a lesser extent, I'd say 2013, were a new level of dysfunction around it. And I would say I prefer that Congress would see the light and say, like other Western countries that manage their budgets without a debt ceiling, we would be better off just turning to the primary budgeting process as a way to handle our question of how much debt we're going to incur. I would prefer that, but if they insist on keeping the debt ceiling going, in some ways it seems desirable to make it as the subject of as little controversy as possible. And it doesn't seem totally implausible that it could again sort of recede into something that normal citizens never have to think about.
I mean, I think one of the, to me at least, it's not clear exactly what the president's incentives are before you hit the debt ceiling, in terms of does the president want to show his hand and go ahead and announce that he's seen Phil's talk and has been totally persuaded by it. The first best solution for
I don't know, based on this election, do you want to be associated with the president? Yeah.
I think the first best
Public service
option from the president's perspective in terms of business as usual, keeping things going, is Congress needs to raise the debt ceiling. That's how we've always done things in the past. That creates the least amount of uncertainty about the validity of our debt and so forth. But if Congress knows that the president has some tricks up his sleeve, then Congress may lose its own incentive to raise the debt ceiling, because it can suddenly say, well, actually there won't be a total and complete catastrophe, because the president can kind of bail us out. And I think the president doesn't really want Congress to know that ahead of time. I don't know. That's how I see the politics of it.
I would also say I think there's zero chance that Congress will just repeal the debt ceiling, because the optics around it are too bad. But this suspending the debt ceiling, which is what we have right now, is an innovation of the recent confrontations. We had never done that before. We always in the past set a number, and now we're not setting a number. We're suspending it until it resets to a new number at the date that it comes back in. So I do see maybe there's the way Congress would effectively defang the debt ceiling would be through some sort of expanded McConnell rule, and it would be sort of a lot of procedural trickery to make it recede into the background. And I think the smartest move for the president would be to work to help make that happen, make that a reality, rather than sort of making it more confrontational by sort of playing out the end game.
I'm wondering if President Obama is sitting in his office right now and picks up the phone and calls any one of you and says, beginning of 2015, I'm going to go headlong and bypass the debt ceiling. I'm going to ignore it completely, and I need one of you to tell me who it is that's going to have standing, how are we going to make it a justiciable issue, and how can we get the court involved so they can tell us what does this provision in the 14th Amendment mean, what does the Constitution mean, does the debt ceiling actually apply, how am I supposed to handle this stuff? Is that possible, or is that a truly political question? Is that something that the people are supposed to be interpreting and taking to the ballot box? Yeah, I can't see anyone that would have standing other than potentially Congress itself. And as I said, if Congress could agree on that to pass a joint resolution or something like that, maybe, but that would get filibustered, so you'd have to have even more strength in the party opposed to the president in Congress than we do now, even after this election, to be able to do that. Maybe then you would have standing, and even then the courts would probably, almost certainly, call it a political question, which doctrine is dodgy. I might prefer to narrow that doctrine, but I think how they would act is that they would not ultimately get a rule. And that's not necessarily bad. I agree with when Philip said that we shouldn't approach all questions as all constitutional questions, even as ultimately needing to be resolved by the courts. All actors in the system are constitutionally bound, and ultimately the Constitution is a piece of paper with writing on it. And if the people don't want to enforce it, then no court judgment is going to affect that.
I think it would be a long shot, but you could maybe try to get standing through someone who's currently holding a treasury bond and saying my injury in fact is that the value of my bond is less than it would be in the absence of a debt ceiling. Well, I think that would be a stretch.
But what would the potential judicial remedy even be?
Yeah. I guess they would just declare the statute unconstitutional.
Not all constitutional politics ends up in courts. I think that's an important lesson to take away. Is a lot of constitutional politics is interbranch conflict that can't be reduced to justiciable questions.
Yeah. When the court gives a declaratory remedy, it's relying on the other branches then to do something, and the whole problem here is they're not doing
right?
something, right?
But, yeah.
Thank you for this discussion. We've talked a lot about what the president could, should, might do in this scenario. Legally, what is the president legally bound to do if Congress appropriates above the debt limit but does not raise the debt limit?
Well, that's what we've been discussing.
I think you're asking, what would the lawyers in the Office of Legal Counsel try to make of this situation? And I think the answer is they should be just as confused as the rest of us.
They will be trying to justify whatever the president ultimately decides to do.
Yeah.
I'd like to return to the idea of prioritization for a minute, and whether I mean, from a policy perspective, we can all discuss what different agencies could or should do, what the president could or should do, or Congress could or should do. But from a constitutional perspective, is there some prioritization that's built into the structure of the Constitution? I admit I was not familiar with the debt provision of the 14th Amendment. It's not what we tend to talk about when we talk about the 14th Amendment most of the time. But for today, it's, you know, rises to a level. The debt of the United States is given a certain stature in the 14th Amendment, but is all debt the same as other debt? For instance, can some people think of debt, what we promised to pay or return to pay for people who loan us something, as compared with what we promised to pay for the future through entitlements or programs or future contracts? In other words, is debt different than simply a future promise or even a today promise to pay you a Social Security check or a Medicaid payment? Is there a distinction there constitutionally?
I don't have off the top of my head the ability to answer that very well. I can tell you that Professor Jack Balkin has had some interesting debates on his blog, Balkanization, digging into the original meaning of the 14th Amendment and trying to figure out exactly what public debt means from the perspective of the 1860s. I think there's some hard questions about when exactly obligations become debt. Obviously, a Social Security that's abstractly promised 30 years in the future is quite different from somebody who expects a check today, and that there may be sort of a legal difference also. There are some people who think that public debt must encompass the kinds of things, obligations that are coming due today. There are other people who think that it only has to do with the principal of the Treasury bonds, perhaps the principal plus the interest payments. There's not an easy answer.
I think there is a distinction, and I agree with Larry Tribe here. I rarely agree with him, but his writing on this, he points to such things as even within Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, there's separate references to debt and obligations. That is, the validity of the public debt shall not be questioned, but any debt or obligation incurred in an insurrection is another part of it. Congress rejected an earlier version of the clause that would have protected debts or obligations. And the context, more broadly, of the Constitution, the word debt is used 5 times, and it's nonsensical in all of those times to read it as saying debts or other obligations. The optics of it, again, we keep talking about these non-legal things, are important as well, because effectively, if you recognize that distinction, which, as I said, I think that's the better of the argument, that means that wealthy, institutional, sometimes foreign debt holders get paid before Social Security checks get sent out, or soldier salaries, that sort of thing. But I do think that there are different categories of debt, and I don't think that Perry, by the way, that 1935 case that sometimes is used or invoked for the proposition that future authorized spending is the same as debt, I don't think that said that much.
Thanks. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more. We'll see.
Thank you. If we assume that the country's debt is an accurate reflection of our financial condition, if we do that, and if we strive for a non-confrontational settling of future debt limit raises to occur, isn't that admitting to an ever-increasing of our national debt?
We have a budgeting process. If Congress doesn't want to spend money, it shouldn't spend money. The solution is amazingly straightforward. Of course, it's also potentially politically costly. people like the spending that Congress does. So Congress is eager to keep spending the money, but somehow say that it is really concerned about debt by talking about the debt ceiling. But that's my argument is they're pulling an act of misdirection when they do that. They're drawing attention to talk about the debt ceiling as if they're capable of solving the problem with it, but they're not. If they want to spend less money, they should spend less money.
An interesting corollary to that would be, what if Congress, get past a filibuster or whatever, Congress passes a budget that would take away the debt ceiling problem, but the president doesn't like that budget. Is he constitutionally obligated to, I think Michael mentioned this alternative, to sign that? Certainly in terms of the political debate, that would put him in weaker stead. He wouldn't say my hands are tied. The response is, well, Congress passed this law. You didn't seem to like it. You'd prefer to extra constitutionally blow through the debt ceiling. So I think that the political dynamic there would militate for a different sort of resolution than what we have now.
I think we have time for one more question.
Good morning. Our distinguished speaker from Brookings mentioned logistical issues, potential logistical issues regarding the prioritization of payments by the Treasury, if that point came to pass where that was needed. Do you think that's a pure factuality, or do you think there's some political games going on regarding that, as far as what's being presented?
I think the truth is you should never sort of overestimate the competence of our public servants. And the truth is people just really don't know how it would play out. The best work that's being done on this is by the Bipartisan Policy Center. You can look up their work on trying to figure out exactly what Treasury is prepared to do. The fact is that these are not the issues that Treasury occupies itself with on a day-to-day basis. There aren't people whose job is to figure this out normally. So they just really haven't asked themselves all these questions and haven't figured out the answers. They hope never to reach these eventualities. So I don't think it's gamesmanship. I think there is a significant element of doubt about exactly how things could play out.